burial vault. The castle's cold, damp air seemed to thicken as Emily and the group descended a narrow stone staircase that they'd found hidden behind a false panel in the dining hall. The steps spiraled downward into darkness, their uneven surfaces worn smooth by centuries of use. Each step creaked under their weight, the sound amplified by the silence that surrounded them. Emily led the way, her flashlight beams slicing through the oppressive gloom. Maggie was close behind, muttering what sounded like prayers under her breath. Alice and Liam brought up the rear, their nervous whispers barely audible over the faint drip of water echoing from below. "Are we sure this is a good idea?" Liam asked, his voice tight with apprehension. "I mean, it's a crypt. Nothing good ever happens in a crypt. We don't have a choice," Emily replied, her words clipped. The map Connor found in Michael Shaw's journal marked this place for a reason. "Whatever's down here, it's important." Alice groaned softly. "Important or deadly? I swear, if something jumps out of one of these walls." "Enough," Maggie said sharply. "Stay focused. We're not alone down here." The crypt unveiled. At the base of the staircase, the group emerged into a cavernous chamber. The air was colder here, thick with the unmistakable scent of earth and decay. The walls were lined with stone alcoves, each one holding a crumbling coffin or an urn encrusted with centuries of dust. The floor was littered with shattered bones and fragments of pottery, as though the crypt had been ransacked long ago. Emily swept her flashlight across the room, her breath catching as the beam illuminated a large stone sarcophagus in the center of the chamber. Its lid was intricately carved with symbols, some resembling those she'd seen in the tower, and others she couldn't decipher. The name Evelyn Shaw was etched in flowing script along the base. "This must be it," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "Evelyn's resting place." "Resting?" Alice said, her voice cracking. "You think she's still resting after everything we've seen?" Liam stepped cautiously toward the sarcophagus, his flashlight beam darting nervously across the walls. "It's smaller than I thought," he murmured. Maggie frowned, her gaze fixed on the sarcophagus. "It's not just a grave," she said. "It's a seal, a cold grip." As Emily approached the sarcophagus, the temperature in the room seemed to plummet. Her breath misted in front of her, and her flashlight flickered, its beam dimming. She placed a hand on the edge of the stone lid, her fingers trembling as she traced the carved symbols. Suddenly, something cold and unyielding wrapped around her ankle. She let out a startled scream, jerking her leg back, but the grip tightened. It felt like fingers, bony and impossibly strong, clamping down on her flesh. Emily staggered, her flashlight slipping from her hand and clattering to the floor. "Help!" she cried, her voice echoing off the stone walls. Maggie was the first to reach her, her hands fumbling for the flashlight. She directed the beam toward Emily's leg, revealing a skeletal hand protruding from a crack in the floor. Its fingers dug into Emily's ankle, pulling with a force that made her stumble. Alice and Liam rushed forward, grabbing Emily's arms and pulling her back. The skeletal hand resisted, its grip like iron, but with a final desperate tug, they wrenched Emily free. She collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath. The hand withdrew into the crack, the sound of scraping bone echoing through the crypt. "What the hell was that?" Alice shouted, her voice trembling. "What is this place?" Emily looked down at her ankle, where dark bruises were already forming. "It's not just a crypt," she said, her voice shaking. "It's a prison." The seal begins to crack. As they regrouped, the chamber began to tremble. The ground beneath them shuddered, sending small rocks and debris raining from the ceiling. The symbols on the sarcophagus glowed faintly, their edges pulsing with an eerie green light. "Something's waking up," Maggie said, her voice low and urgent. "We've disturbed the seal." Liam backed toward the staircase, his flashlight darting nervously around the room. "Maybe we should leave. Right now." "We can't," Emily said, forcing herself to stand despite the pain in her ankle. "This is what Evelyn wanted us to find. This is why she's been trying to reach us." "And what exactly are we supposed to do?" Alice demanded. "Open it. Release whatever's inside." "Maybe," Emily said, her voice wavering. Or maybe we're supposed to stop it from being released. The spirit's warning. Before anyone could move, the glowing light from the sarcophagus intensified, filling the room with an otherworldly radiance. The trembling stopped abruptly, replaced by a low, resonant hum that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. A figure began to materialize above the sarcophagus, a faint, shimmering form that flickered like a candle in the wind. It was a girl, no older than 10, her long hair flowing around her pale face. Her eyes were wide and filled with sorrow. "Evelyn," Emily whispered. The spirit turned to face them, her lips moving soundlessly. The hum in the room grew louder, and the group leaned closer, straining to hear her words. "Don't let him out," Evelyn said, her voice faint and broken, as though carried on the edge of a dying breath. "Who?" Emily asked, stepping forward. "Who are we stopping?" Evelyn's form flickered, her face contorted with fear. "Michael, my father," she said. "He's in the crypt. He's waiting." The awakening. At Evelyn's words, the sarcophagus began to shake violently, its lid sliding slightly ajar with a loud grinding noise. The glow from the symbols turned blood red, casting ominous shadows across the room. "No!" Evelyn cried, her voice rising to a desperate wail. She turned to the group, her translucent hands outstretched. "You must stop him. He will destroy everything." Maggie grabbed Emily's arm. "We need to reinforce the seal," she said. "Whatever Michael Shaw did to trap himself here, we need to strengthen it." Emily nodded, her mind racing. "The journal," she said. "Connor's journal had notes on the ritual. We can use it." "But Connor's not here," Alice pointed out. "And we don't have time to figure it out." The sarcophagus lid shifted further, and a foul stench filled the room. Decay and rot mingled with something acrid and chemical. A low, guttural growl rumbled from within, and the shadows on the walls began to writhe. "Then we improvise," Maggie said, pulling a piece of chalk from her bag. She dropped to her knees and began drawing a circle around the sarcophagus, her hands moving with frantic precision. The struggle, the growl grew louder, and a skeletal hand reached out from the sarcophagus, its bony fingers clawing at the air. Evelyn screamed, her form flickering wildly as she threw herself against the lid, trying to push it closed. "Keep him inside," she cried, her voice desperate. Emily and Alice rushed forward, adding their weight to Evelyn's. The lid groaned in protest, but it began to slide back into place. Maggie chanted under her breath, her voice growing louder with each word. The sarcophagus shuddered violently, and the growl turned into a roar. The skeletal hand withdrew, and the glow from the symbols dimmed. Finally, with a deafening clang, the lid slammed shut. Aftermath. The room fell silent, the oppressive energy dissipating like a receding tide. Evelyn's form flickered one last time before vanishing, her sorrowful gaze lingering on Emily. Maggie slumped to the ground, her breathing ragged. "That won't hold him forever," she said. "We need to find a way to finish this." Emily nodded, her heart still racing. As they began their ascent back to the surface, she couldn't shake the feeling that their time was running out, and that Michael Shaw's prison was far from secure. The crypt. The crypt was a suffocating labyrinth of death and decay, its air heavy with centuries of dust and rot. The group had just begun to regroup after sealing Michael Shaw's sarcophagus when a faint scraping sound caught Emily's attention. She froze, her heart pounding as the noise grew louder, echoing through the chamber like nails on stone. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. Alice nodded, her eyes wide. "It's coming from..." Before she could finish, Liam let out a sharp gasp, his flashlight trembling in his hand. He pointed toward one of the alcoves along the wall, where a man stood half hidden in the shadows. His tall, broad-shouldered frame was unfamiliar, and his face was obscured by the dim light. "Who the hell are you?" Alice demanded, stepping forward despite Maggie's warning hand on her arm. The man turned, revealing a face Emily hadn't seen before, angular and weathered, with sharp blue eyes and a faint scar tracing his jawline. He was dressed in a heavy coat, a battered satchel slung across his shoulder. "Name's Declan," he said, his voice gruff. "I'm investigating this place. Same as you." Emily narrowed her eyes. Investigating? What are you doing down here? Same as you, I imagine, Declan replied, glancing around the room. Searching for answers. But if you're smart, you'll leave before you find them. Maggie stepped forward, her expression hard. If you know anything about this crypt or the castle's curse, now's the time to share it. Declan hesitated, his gaze flicking toward the sarcophagus. I've seen things, he said finally. Things that shouldn't exist. And if you've opened that, we didn't open it, Emily said quickly. We sealed it. Whatever's in there is staying put. Declan's lips twitched in a humorless smile. Then you've already made a mistake. The trap is sprung. As Declan spoke, his hand brushed against one of the nearby alcoves, disturbing a pile of ancient bones. The dry, brittle remains clattered to the ground, the sound unnaturally loud in the silent chamber. Maggie winced, her eyes darting toward the sarcophagus. You shouldn't have done that, she said, her voice sharp. Before anyone could react, the crypt trembled violently, sending dust and loose stones cascading from the ceiling. The walls seemed to groan, and a deep guttural growl echoed through the chamber. What did you do? Alice shouted, backing away from the disturbed alcove. Declan looked around, his face pale. I didn't mean to. His words were cut off by a deafening clang as one of the stone coffins along the wall burst open. A figure emerged from the shadows, a towering, skeletal form clad in rusted armor. Its hollow eye sockets burned with an unnatural green fire, and its bony hands gripped a massive, jagged blade. Emily felt her breath catch in her throat. The air around the creature seemed to ripple with malice, and the temperature plummeted as it stepped forward, its movements unnervingly fluid for something so ancient. What the hell is that? Liam whispered, his voice trembling. The Guardian, Maggie said, her tone grim. The Crypt Sentinel. It hunts anyone who disturbs the dead. The Guardian awakens. The Guardian let out a low, guttural growl, raising its blade as it scanned the room. Its glowing eyes locked onto Declan, who had stumbled backward, his satchel spilling its contents across the floor. We need to get out of here, Alice said, her voice rising with panic. Now. No, Maggie said firmly. If we run, it will hunt us. We have to face it. Face it, Liam said, his eyes wide. With what? Flashlights and a prayer. The Guardian took another step forward, its blade scraping against the stone floor. The sound was like nails on a chalkboard, and Emily felt her knees go weak. She looked around desperately for anything that might serve as a weapon or a shield, but the crypt offered no such salvation. Declan cursed under his breath. Fumbling with the items spilled from his satchel, he pulled out a small vial of clear liquid and a crude, rune-etched dagger. Stay back, he said, his voice tight. I'll distract it. Get to the staircase. The Guardian lunged, its massive blade arcing through the air with terrifying speed. Declan rolled to the side, narrowly avoiding the strike as the weapon smashed into the floor, sending shards of stone flying. The fight for survival. The group scattered, each scrambling to avoid the Guardian's relentless attacks. Emily darted behind a crumbling pillar, her heart racing as the creature's blade slammed into the ground inches away. Dust and debris filled the air, making it difficult to see or breathe. Declan, what are you doing? Maggie shouted as the man threw the vial at the Guardian's feet. The glass shattered, releasing a burst of acrid smoke that momentarily blinded the creature. Buying us time, Declan called back. He raised the rune-etched dagger, its surface glowing faintly in the dim light. This should hold it. If I can get close enough. The Guardian roared, the sound echoing through the crypt like a thunderclap. It swung its blade in a wide arc, forcing the group to scatter again. Emily ducked behind another pillar, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. This thing's unstoppable, Alice shouted, crouching near Maggie. No, Maggie said, her eyes narrowing. It's bound to the crypt. If we can sever its connection to this place, we might be able to stop it. How? Emily asked, her voice shaking. Maggie gestured toward the symbols carved into the sarcophagus. Those sigils, they're part of the binding. If we destroy them, it might weaken the Guardian. A desperate plan. Emily nodded, forcing herself to move. She darted toward the sarcophagus, her flashlight beam bouncing wildly as she ran. The Guardian spotted her and let out another guttural roar, its blade smashing into the ground behind her. "Keep it distracted," she shouted over her shoulder. Declan lunged at the creature, plunging the glowing dagger into its side. The Guardian let out a deafening scream, its skeletal form convulsing as green fire erupted from the wound. It swatted Declan away with a bone-crushing force, sending him crashing into a nearby wall. Emily reached the sarcophagus, her hands trembling as she traced the glowing sigils. The symbols pulsed with energy, their faint green light casting eerie shadows on the walls. She grabbed a loose rock from the ground and raised it high. "Here goes nothing," she muttered, slamming the rock into the nearest symbol. The sigil cracked, its glow dimming. The Guardian staggered, its blade dropping slightly as it let out a distorted wail. Encouraged, Emily struck another sigil, then another, each blow weakening the creature further. The Guardian's wrath. The Guardian turned its burning gaze on Emily, its movements growing more erratic. It raised its blade, preparing to strike, but Maggie stepped in front of her, holding up a handful of salt and a piece of chalk. "Not today," Maggie said, throwing the salt at the creature's face. The Guardian recoiled, its fiery eyes dimming momentarily. "Now, Emily," Maggie shouted. With a final swing, Emily shattered the last sigil. The crypt trembled violently, and the Guardian let out a deafening roar as its form began to disintegrate. Green fire erupted from its chest, consuming its skeletal frame until nothing remained but ash. Aftermath. The tremor ceased, and the crypt fell silent. Emily sank to the ground, her body trembling with exhaustion. Declan limped toward them, clutching his side but still alive. "You're insane," he muttered, shaking his head. But that worked. Maggie knelt beside Emily, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "It's not over yet," she said quietly, "but we've bought ourselves some time." As the group began to climb the staircase back to the surface, Emily glanced over her shoulder at the now dormant sarcophagus. She couldn't shake the feeling that they had only delayed the inevitable, and that Michael Shaw's true wrath was still to come. Bride's revenge. The group's hurried footsteps echoed down the narrow passage as they retreated from the Guardian's remains. The suffocating air of the crypt pressed against them, and though the immediate threat had been vanquished, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. They emerged into another chamber smaller and darker than the last. The room was lined with sarcophagi and tombs, their stone surfaces covered in faded carvings and inscriptions. A single, ornate coffin stood upright against the far wall, its gilded edges gleaming faintly in the light of their flashlights. "What now?" Alice asked, her voice tight with exhaustion. "We keep running into new horrors every 5 minutes." Maggie gestured toward the coffin, her brow furrowed in concern. "That doesn't belong here. Look at it, too ornate for a crypt this simple. It's like someone wanted it to stand out." Emily moved closer, her flashlight beam revealing the faint outline of a name etched into the gilded surface. Lady Eleanor Shaw. Beneath the name was a carving of a bride in an elaborate gown, her hands clutching a bouquet of roses. "Another Shaw," Emily murmured, "but I don't remember seeing her name in the journal." Maggie's face darkened. "That's because someone wanted her erased." The bride's tragedy. As Maggie examined the coffin, Alice wandered toward one of the alcoves along the wall, her flashlight flickering. "What's the story here?" she asked, her voice laced with sarcasm. "Dead Shaw. Big whoop. They're all dead." "Not just dead," Maggie said, her voice cold. "Forgotten. Whoever Eleanor was, someone didn't want her story told." Emily stepped closer to the coffin, her fingers brushing against the intricate carvings. "Lady Eleanor Shaw. She was a bride," she said softly, her voice filled with a mixture of curiosity and unease. "But why was she buried down here, away from the others?" Maggie's face hardened as she pieced it together. "A wrongful burial," she said. "If she was cast out or punished, it wasn't because she deserved it. It was to silence her." Before anyone could respond, a sudden, sharp crack echoed through the chamber. The group turned toward the sound as a jagged fissure split across the face of the coffin. The air grew colder, and the faint scent of roses filled the room. "What the hell?" Alice muttered, stepping back instinctively. The fissure widened, and with a deafening bang, the coffin burst open. The bride awakes. A skeletal figure stepped forward, draped in the tattered remains of an elegant wedding gown. The fabric was yellowed with age, and the lace hung in shreds from her bony frame. Her skull was adorned with a tarnished tiara, and a veil of cobwebs clung to her empty eye sockets. The skeletal bride tilted her head, her movements unnervingly fluid for something so decayed. When she opened her mouth, her voice echoed like a distant wail carried on the wind. "Why have you disturbed my rest?" she demanded, her tone laced with sorrow and rage. The group froze, their breaths catching as the bride stepped forward. Her hollow gaze swept over them, but it stopped on Alice. "You," the bride hissed, her voice rising. "You mock the dead." Alice's eyes widened, her flashlight trembling in her hand. "What? No, Justice," the bride screamed, her voice reverberating through the chamber. "You would desecrate my memory as they did." The skeletal bride lunged at Alice, her bony fingers outstretched. Emily reacted instinctively, grabbing Alice's arm and pulling her out of the way. The bride's claws swiped at the air, missing them by inches. The bride's wrath. The bride let out a shriek of fury, her veil billowing as though caught in an invisible wind. Her form shimmered, flickering between solid and spectral, and she turned her burning gaze toward the rest of the group. "Do not interfere," she cried. "Her mockery will not go unpunished." Maggie stepped forward, raising her hands in a gesture of peace. "Lady Eleanor," she said firmly, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "We mean no disrespect. We're here to uncover the truth, to honor your story." The bride hesitated, her form flickering again. "The truth," she whispered, her voice softening. "No one sought the truth. They buried me here. They buried me alive." The group gasped, the weight of her words sinking in. Emily felt a chill run through her as she imagined the horrors Lady Eleanor must have endured. "Why?" Emily asked gently. "Why did they do this to you?" The bride's skeletal hands clenched into fists, and her voice rose once more. "Because I defied him. Because I saw his darkness and spoke against it." "Michael Shaw," Maggie said, her tone grim. "It was him, wasn't it?" Eleanor's form grew more solid, her gown flowing around her like smoke. "He was a monster," she said. "He sought to twist life and death, and I dared to challenge him. For that, he bound me to this crypt, cursing me to eternal silence." Alice's reckoning. As Eleanor spoke, her gaze returned to Alice, her anger rekindling. "And now you laugh at my suffering," she cried. "You belittle the pain of the forgotten." "I didn't mean," Alice began, but her words were cut off as the bride lunged again. This time, her skeletal fingers closed around Alice's wrist, their icy grip sending shockwaves through her body. Alice screamed, falling to her knees as a cold, suffocating energy enveloped her. "Get it off me," she cried, her voice breaking. Emily and Liam rushed forward, trying to pry Eleanor's grip loose, but the bride's strength was inhuman. Maggie knelt beside Alice, pulling a vial of holy water from her bag. "Hold still," Maggie commanded, uncorking the vial and splashing its contents onto Eleanor's skeletal hand. The bride let out a bone-chilling scream, releasing Alice and staggering backward. Her form flickered violently, her veil dissolving into strands of shadow. A bargain with the dead. Eleanor's rage subsided, and she sank to her knees, her voice breaking with grief. "All I wanted was peace," she said. "But even in death, I am denied it." Emily stepped forward cautiously, her heart aching for the tragic figure before her. "We can help you," she said. "If we find the truth about Michael, if we stop him, maybe we can set you free." The bride's hollow gaze fixed on Emily. "You would risk your lives for one forgotten soul." Emily nodded. "No one deserves to be silenced like this. If we can help you, we will." Eleanor tilted her head, her skeletal form trembling. Very well, she said. But know this. Michael's curse binds not only me, but the castle itself. To free me is to face his wrath. We'll face it, Maggie said firmly. But we need your help. Tell us what we need to do. The bride reached toward the wall, her bony fingers brushing against a hidden panel. It slid open with a soft click, revealing a narrow passageway leading deeper into the crypt. Follow the path, she said. It will lead you to the heart of his power. Eleanor's form began to fade, her voice growing fainter. But beware, the deeper you go, the stronger his darkness becomes. Into the depths. As the bride vanished, the group stood in stunned silence, the weight of her words pressing down on them. Alice clutched her wrist, her breath still shaky from the encounter. Do we trust her? Liam asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily nodded, her resolve hardening. We don't have a choice. With that, they stepped into the newly revealed passageway, their flashlights cutting through the suffocating darkness. The air grew colder with each step, and the walls seemed to close in around them. As they ventured deeper into the crypt, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking straight into the heart of the castle's curse, and that Michael Shaw was waiting for them.